Chapter 53 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Judy Mason. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 53. Committed for Trial. The adjourned inquiry is again resumed before the coroner 2 days after the return of Alexis from Liverpool, with his companion the butler, whom he has contrived to keep snugly hidden under Robert Faunthorpe's roof, where Podmore, his wife and children, have been boarded and lodged, and kept in custody by the faithful Hester, who watches her charges as a cat watches a mouse. "Remember, you are not one of you to put so much as your noses out of doors till I come for you," says Alexis impressively. "Not a creature in Redcastle is to know of your return till the right moment." "As long as I have my meals regular, I'm satisfied," replies Podmore. "I never was a prowler about the streets." So the Podmore family occupy the kitchen at Dr. Faunthorpe's, and no one outside the doctor's house knows anything about these extra inmates. Alexis and Mr. Levison have crossed each other on the railroad, and that gentleman has returned from a bootless journey to the Washington, considerably out of temper. He has reconciled himself, however, to this wasted expedition in finding what his client has done. Joel Pilgrim is still at the Coach and Horses, where he lives well and seems to enjoy life. He plays billiards, and makes himself eminently agreeable to the youth of Redcastle, Fred Stormont included, but he complains loudly of his detention in the town on account of the sad business of his old friend's mysterious death, while his own affairs need his presence in Calcutta. "This dawdling old corridor may drag the inquiry out for the next month," he says, "and at last arrive at the conclusion that my poor friend was poisoned by some person or persons unknown. I don't see that there's evidence enough to bring the crime home to that poor girl, and it seems a hard thing that a young and lovely woman should be placed in such a position." Frederick sighs and shakes his head and shrugs his shoulders. "It is hard," he says, "and I've positively worshipped that girl, you know, devoted myself to her quite awfully. And now to find that there was a husband in the background all the while shows a want of candour, you know." "Proves an artful disposition, certainly," replies Mr. Pilgrim. "But if every artful young woman took to disposing of people with prussic acid, there'd be an alarming decrease in the population." "True," says Fred. "Well, I'm sure she didn't do it, poor thing. But I'm sorry to say the opinion of the town is against her." He says this with an air which implies that to be condemned by public opinion in Redcastle is to have received a sentence from a supreme tribunal, and to be found guilty at a bar from which there is no court of appeal. "I really feel for her, you know," says Fred, as he prostrates himself upon the green cloth to aim at a distant ball. "But the town thinks badly of the case. She had the poison in her possession, you know, and she ran away, you know. It's difficult to avoid making 4 out of 2 such 2s." "Looks suspicious, certainly," replies Mr. Pilgrim. "As far as the running away goes, she might have done that to avoid marrying you." "Certainly," says Fred, reflectively. "Well, that would have been a very childish proceeding," answers Joel. "She had only to tell me the truth, and all question of marriage would have been at an end. But women do odd things sometimes, you know. They're apt to get wrong in their heads when they're frightened. I don't think Sibyl is that sort of girl. She must have been a very cool hand to come here to her uncle, the wife of a man whose name he detested, and pass herself off as a single woman, and play her cards to inherit a fortune." "True," says Frederick despondently, and his opinion of Sibyl is a little worse than it was before Mr. Pilgrim undertook her defence. It is just possible that Mr. Pilgrim would not remain at Redcastle quite so patiently were it not for a suspicion on his part that a certain shabby little man in black, who hangs about the public rooms of the hotel and spends a good deal of his time in the hall and porch, and contrives always to be in the way when Mr. Pilgrim goes out, nay, even happens to have business or pleasure that takes him exactly the same way, has been set as a watch upon somebody's movements, and that any attempt to hasten his intended journey to Calcutta might be attended with unpleasant consequences. Whatever perils may surround Mr. Pilgrim's path will be best overcome by a calm adherence to his present policy, or at least so argues that gentleman, and he quietly awaits the conclusion of the examination in which his evidence is required. On this bright summer morning the same crowd is again gathered in the well-known assembly room, a room famous for town and county balls, for concerts and fancy fairs and other local festivities, but affording a scene of more absorbing interest today than the most aristocratic of dances or charity bazaars. Mrs. Stormont is there again, with her constant ally Mrs. Groshen, wearing the same veils and bonnets, and seated in the same sheltered corner near the reporter's table. There is Mr. Levinson sitting near the coroner, with that Memnon's head of his, stony and inexpressive, but certainly not given to melodious breathings at sunrise or any other time. There sits Sybil, pale as marble, and calm as a statue, her husband standing behind her chair. Today there are fresh witnesses to be examined, so runs the rumour, and there is an eager curiosity about these new witnesses and the evidence they may give. The first witness called is Bathsheba Skinner, spinster, lately cook and housekeeper in the employment of the deceased. "What can that woman have to say about the case?" mutters Joel Pilgrim to Colonel Stormont, who is standing next to him. "Not much, I should think, unless she poisoned him in one of her curries," replies the colonel. "Deuced good curries they were." Bathsheba Skinner is sworn, and stands up before the assembly, vinegar-faced, but eminently respectable, with black kid gloves, a trifle too long in the fingers on her industrious hands, and a pictorial brooch a little smaller than a cheese plate clasping her rusty black lace shawl. "You were in the habit of preparing all nourishment that was taken up to Mr. Trenchard's room," says the coroner, after a few preliminary questions. "Broths, arrowroot, and so on." "Yes, sir, I did it all with my own hands. There was many things I might have left to the kitchen maid, but I felt it was my duty to see to it myself. There was not a thing in the way of beef tea or jelly or tapioca or arrowroot that went up to Mr. Trenchard which was not prepared by my own hands." "And are you sure that nothing of a poisonous nature entered into any of these things?" "As sure as I am that I'm alive, sir." "Come, you may have used essences to flavour your jelly, or your tapioca, essential oil of almonds, or at any rate essence of almonds. That is a favourite flavouring with cooks, and a dangerous one. Didn't you use essence of almonds to flavour Mr. Trenchard's jelly?" "I hadn't a drop in the house, sir. I never have held with such stuff. When I want almond flavouring, I use the best Jordans at 2 shillings a pound. But I know my business better than to use almond flavouring of any kind for an invalid. Invalid cookery can't be too simple." "You did not even use bitter almonds, or ratafia, peach kernels, or anything of that kind?" "No, sir." "You slept on the same floor as Podmore, the butler, I believe?" "Yes, sir. My room was next to his." "Did you hear anything remarkable, any unusual stir or movement, in short, anything at all out of the common course in Podmore's room, or on the stairs leading to Podmore's room during the night of your master's death?" "Well, sir, I did hear something which struck me at the time as curious, and yet it might mean nothing. I mentioned it afterwards to Podmore, and he put me down." "You mustn't tell us what you said to Podmore, or how he answered you. That isn't evidence. We want to know what you heard on the night of the 23rd of June. Well, sir, I am a light sleeper at all times, and perhaps I was extra wakeful on that night on account of the wedding that was fixed for the next day. It was to be quite a quiet wedding, and there was no breakfast ordered, but I'd cooked a tongue and a pair of fowls, and made a jelly and a cream or two, and boiled a bit of salmon for a mayonnaise, and got everything in order to put a pretty little luncheon on the table, and the fag and worry of that had overtired me, so that I got very little sleep. It was broad daylight, and I was just dropping off, when I heard Podmore get up and go downstairs in his creaky slippers. "He's gone down to give master his medicine," says I to myself. "I won't try to go to sleep no more till he comes up again, or else he'll be startling me just as I'm dropping off comfortable again. He won't be gone above 5 minutes." Well, I waited and waited, but instead of being gone 5 minutes as usual, it was a good half-hour before Podmore came upstairs again. "Did you look at your watch?" asks a precise juryman. "Lor, no, sir, but I can guess a half-hour as well as any one. I've got into the way of it over my roasting. A good cook knows the value of time. It was a full half-hour before Podmore came up, and then he came up ever so slowly, holding to the baluster, and his footstep was as heavy as lead. And when he got into his room, he flung himself down on his bed and gave a groan. 'What was the matter with you last night?' I asked him at breakfast time. At first he didn't seem as if he understood what I meant, but when I told him I'd heard him groaning, he said he'd had an attack of spasms, and he'd been down to the pantry to look for some mustard for a poultice. I didn't think much more of it after that, and an hour later the house was all upset by my master's death. But I've thought of it since many times." "Do you know what time it was when Podmore went downstairs?" "It was a few minutes after 5. I'd heard the stable clock strike a little before, and I took particular notice on account of it being just an hour late for Mr. Trenchard's medicine, for 4 o'clock was the hour at which he ought to have took it." "There was nothing else he remarked that night?" "No, sir." "I think that will do. I beg your pardon," interposes Mr. Levison. "I should like to ask the witness one or two questions. Pray, will you be kind enough, Mrs. Skinner, to tell the jury of a conversation which you heard outside Mr. Trenchard's door on the last evening but one before his death?" "I did certainly overhear a conversation, sir." "What can any such conversation or any eavesdropping whatever have to do with the question at issue?" cries Joel Pilgrim, livid with anger or fear. The change in his countenance is noticed by everyone, just as the less marked change during the last examination was noticed by a few. "We shall see how far the conversation is relevant, sir," replies the coroner, "when Mrs. Skinner has answered Mr. Levison's question." "I did hear a conversation, sir, between my master and Mr. Pilgrim," says Mrs. Skinner, with a vindictive look at Joel, "but I was not eavesdropping. I've lived too long in the best of families to be an eavesdropper, or to be suspected of being such by any gentleman calling himself a gentleman. What I heard that night I heard promiscuous, and I stayed to hear no more than reached my ears promiscuous as I went past Mr. Trenchard's door." Mrs. Skinner goes on to relate the conversation which she had described to Alexis on his visit to Lancaster Lodge. "Gentlemen," cries Joel vehemently, "this is an abominable fabrication, prompted by some hidden influence. No such conversation took place. Mr. Trenchard held no such threat over me. Mrs. Skinner must have been a long time crossing the landing to hear all this, gentlemen of the jury. I tell you that she could not have heard it in that time. She did not hear it at any time, but she invented it, or it has been invented for her." "Mr. Pilgrim, I really cannot allow this," said the coroner. "You will better appreciate Mr. Pilgrim's warmth when you have heard the next witness," says Mr. Levison. A faint flush of colour warms Sibyl's marble cheek. She feels as if light were coming swiftly through the gloom. Her husband has told her nothing except to trust in Providence and in him. She has so trusted, and those quiet, monotonous days in Redcastle jail are the most peaceful days she has known since she fled from Dixon Street and the poverty more than 3 years ago. Joel Pilgrim looks intently to the other end of the room, watching for the appearance of that witness of whom Mr. Levison has spoken. He starts, and the leaden hue of his countenance takes a more death-like shade when someone calls, "Joseph Podmore!" Podmore advances to the little railed-off space which has been made for the witnesses. He is very pale, and is evidently nervous, but he is perfectly sober. "Now, Mr. Podmore," says Levison, when a few questions, chiefly repetitive, have been asked by the coroner, "will you be good enough to state what happened within your knowledge on the night of Mr. Trenchard's death?" The ex-butler rubs his hands nervously, looks round the assembly, shifts his balance from one foot to the other, coughs dubiously, and then begins. "Gentlemen of the jury, and your worship, I am about to make a statement which I ought to have made before. It has preyed upon my mind, having kept it back. But I am a poor man, with a young family dependent upon my exertions in service. I actually was on my way to New York, gentlemen of the jury and your honour, and had got as far on my voyage as Liverpool, when the facts in question preyed upon my mind to that degree that I felt I must come back to this town to reveal them. I hope this will plead in my favour, your worship and gentlemen of the jury, if there is any irregularity in my not having made this revelation sooner." "The man is drunk or mad," cries Joel, savagely. "The man is sober to-day, Mr. Pilgrim," says the coroner. "Go on, Mr. Podmore." "The statement I have to make relates to the night of my master's death, the night of June 23rd. I was an hour late, gentlemen, on that night in going downstairs to give my master his medicine. I had slept extra heavy, and it was 5 o'clock instead of 4 when I woke. I went down as usual. The house was very quiet, but I took notice that the door of Mr. Pilgrim's bedroom, the secondary door opening onto the landing, stood ajar. So, thinks I, Mr. Pilgrim is with my master. Perhaps he has given the old gentleman his medicine. I wasn't so much surprised as I might have been at Mr. Pilgrim being astir so early, for he was always early. It was one of his Indian ways. Well, gentlemen of the jury, I goes to my master's door, and when I puts my hand against it, the door opens a little way, without any noise, for the locks at Lancaster Lodge are old-fashioned box locks, and the catches give way, so that half your time, though a door looks to be shut, it's not really fastened. The door gave way to my hand, and I looked in. Mr. Trenchard was sitting up in bed, and Mr. Pilgrim was opening a bottle of soda water on the dressing table. I saw him pour some of the soda water into a tumbler, and then I saw him, quick as lightning, pour something out of a bottle in his other hand. As I live, gentlemen of the jury, it didn't strike me at that moment that there was any harm. I thought it was some kind of medicine or drops like Coraldine or Coral, or some of those new-fangled opiates, and I didn't feel myself called on to interfere. There was no time for me to turn it over in my mind, you see. There wasn't a moment between Mr. Pilgrim's pouring the stuff into the glass and his handing the glass to my master. Mr. Trenchard drank it off as a draught. It weren't above a third of a bottle of soda water. He sat for an instant bolt upright, his eyes straining out of his head and glassy. Then he gave one long gasp and fell back on his pillow, purple in the face, as if you'd clutched him by the throat and strangled him. I rushed into the room and lifted him up in my arms. I thought at first he was in a fit, but when I stooped over I smelt a sharp, strong smell like bitter almonds, and then I knew it was prussic acid. "What have you given him?" I asked, but Mr. Pilgrim made no answer. "You've killed him," I said, and then he told me that it was accident. He had taken the wrong bottle. He had taken a bottle of prussic acid, which Mr. Trenchard kept in his medicine chest among other drugs, instead of coral. He seemed in a dreadful state of mind. I couldn't help feeling for him. Who could tell whether it wasn't an accident? And if it was, anybody might have found themselves in the same position. "Spare us your reflections, if you please," says the coroner. "Had your master any medicine chest in his room?" "Yes, there was a small box with about half a dozen bottles in partitions." "Do you know one of these bottles to have contained prussic acid in any form whatever?" "I can't say that I do, your worship. There was hartshorn, and caddleput oil, and tincture of rhubarb, and such like." "You have named 3 bottles out of the half dozen," says the coroner. Mr. Levison whispers into his ear. "Yes, that would be best," says the coroner, and he beckons one of the men in attendance and dispatches him on some errand. "Did Mr. Pilgrim offer you money to hold your tongue about what you had seen?" asks the coroner. Podmore fences with this question for a little, but ends by confessing that Joel Pilgrim did offer him money, that he gave him £20 on the spot, and promised to provide for him hereafter. He further admits that Joel had instigated him to emigrate to America, and had given him neither rest nor peace till he had made all the arrangements for his departure. Mr. Pilgrim had paid his passage on board the Orinoco. By the time this question is settled, the man who has been sent out by the coroner returns, carrying a small mahogany case with brass plates at the corners, an old-fashioned case, divided into 6 compartments, each containing a small square bottle of very thick glass. These bottles the coroner takes out one by one, examines them, and exhibits them to the jury. The 6 bottles contain hartshorn, sal volatile, opium, tincture of rhubarb, cajeput oil, and syrup of squills. Each bottle is carefully labelled, with a label in Stephen Trenchard's handwriting pasted on the glass. "Gentlemen," says the coroner, "I think we have now arrived at a stage in this inquiry when a further adjournment will be necessary. It will be as well to give time for the inquiry which is going on before the magistrate." There is a little consultation, and the jury are dismissed. White to the very lips, Joel Pilgrim turns to Colonel Stormont with a contemptuous shrug of the shoulders. "Was there ever anything so absurd as the manner of this inquiry?" he asks. "There is actually a premium offered for perjury. This man, Secretan, has had ample time to bribe any number of false witnesses. What more easy than for him to get up this story and pay the housekeeper and butler for perjuring themselves?" Colonel Stormont makes no reply. He feels rather uncomfortable in Mr. Pilgrim's neighbourhood after the butler's evidence. The story may be a tissue of lies woven by Sibyl's husband, but on the other hand it is as likely to be true, and that dark face of Joel Pilgrim's tells strange tales. There's a general move towards the door. Mr. Pilgrim is about to pass out with the rest, when a hand is laid upon his shoulder, and Mr. Judbury, the detective officer, takes possession of him. "What do you mean by this?" asks Joel indignantly. "Only that I have a warrant for your apprehension under suspicion of being concerned in the murder of Mr. Trenchard," replies Judbury coolly. "I've had my eye upon you for a good time, but it's always foolish to hurry these things, and if we'd hurried you we shouldn't have had Podmore's attempt to get away to New York, which brought matters to what I call a focus. Come along, sir, I've got a fly outside. You may just as well come quietly." And Joel submits, knowing quite enough about English law and English customs to be aware that anything in the way of resistance would be worse than useless. He shrugs his shoulders and affects to take the matter lightly, though those white lips and haggard eyes of his give the lie to his assumed carelessness. "If your Redcastle magistrates choose to take me into custody on a fabricated charge, they do it at their own peril," he says, loud enough for those around him to hear. "I shall make them pay as heavily for their pig-headed folly as the law will enable me." "Step inside, sir," says Mr. Judbury. "You shall have plenty of law, free, gratis, for nothing." The fly drives off, and Joel makes his entrance for the first time under that medieval archway whose gates were opened just a week ago to admit Sibyl. There is a further examination before the magistrates next day. The same witnesses repeat the same evidence. Mr. Levison cross-questions, and is unusually active. Joel Pilgrim sits in the seat of the accused, side by side with Sybil. He is defended, or rather the case is watched for him, by a rival of Mr. Levison's, a gentleman equal in renown in the criminal courts. Further details are extorted from Podmore under this cross-firing of interrogation, but Joel Pilgrim's solicitor strives in vain to shake one iota of his testimony. If this be perjury, there never was a more accomplished perjurer or a false witness that held more firmly to the lesson he had learned. When the examination of witnesses is concluded, Mr. Levison addresses the magistrates and urges that his client shall be dismissed without a stain upon her character. The magistrates confer together and agree that there is not sufficient evidence to connect Sybil Secretan with the murder, and that she may therefore be set at liberty. This being done, Mr. Levison suggests that she shall be placed in the witness box and examined as to her possession of the prussic acid. Pale and trembling a little, Sybil takes the necessary oath upon the small black book and waits to answer the magistrate's questions. "You have heard your sister's evidence as to your abstraction of the prussic acid from the bottle in your uncle's surgery?" "Yes." "Do you admit to the truth of that statement?" "Yes, I was in great distress of mind at the time, and I thought if there were no other way out of my troubles I might destroy myself. I do not say that I meant to do such a wicked thing. I only considered it as a means of release from my difficulties, open to me at the very last extremity." "And you took the prussic acid with that idea?" "Yes." "You had no other design whatever in taking it?" "None whatever." "Did Mr. Pilgrim know that you had this poison in your possession?" "He did." "How did that happen?" "Am I obliged to answer this question?" asked Sybil. "Yes, it is positively necessary for you to tell us everything relating to your possession of this prussic acid." "It had been arranged by my uncle Trenchard that Mr. Pilgrim and I were to be married. My uncle did not know that I was married already. He had a prejudice against my husband's family, and I had been so foolish as to keep my marriage secret from him. Mr. Pilgrim went to York to obtain the license, and we were to have been married on the Saturday, the day on which I left Lancaster Lodge. I made up my mind to run away at the last, rather than to tell Mr. Trenchard about my marriage. It was a cowardly act, I dare say, but I had deceived him so long that I feared his anger on hearing the truth." "How does this bear upon Mr. Joel Pilgrim's knowing about the prussic acid?" "I am coming to that. It was on the night of his return from York with the marriage license. He came up to my little sitting room late that night, between 10 and 11, and told me about the license. He had been dining, and he seemed in very high spirits." "Do you mean that he was intoxicated?" "Oh, no, he was only a little more excited than usual. He talked a good deal about our marriage, and for the first time in his life he tried to kiss me. I showed him the prussic acid bottle and told him that I would sooner poison myself than let him touch my lips. He was very angry, and he told me that prussic acid was a dangerous thing for a woman to carry about her, and that I was playing with edged tools." "Did he take the bottle from you?" "No." "What became of the bottle after that?" "I really can't tell. My intention was to put it back into my pocket, but I was very much flurried at this time. I may have left it on the table among the books and other things. There were a great many things on the table." "When did you miss the bottle?" "Not till I was in London, when it recurred to my memory. Searched my pocket for it, but it was not to be found." "Were you wearing the same dress you had on upon the evening when you showed Mr. Pilgrim the bottle?" "Yes, it is the dress I am wearing now." This is all. The inquiry is again adjourned. The inquiry before the coroner is concluded next day. The verdict, wilful murder against Joel Pilgrim. The inquiry before the magistrates is concluded the day after by Joel Pilgrim's committal for trial on the capital charge. End of chapter 53.
Chapter 54 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Eaton. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 54. A dark tale, darkly finished. Sybil is free once more. She has been in durance scarcely a fortnight, yet it is a new thing for her to come out into the light of day, and feel that she is at liberty to go where she pleases. It is a wondrous and a strange relief to know that the awful suspicion which has been hanging over her, separating her from all the rest of the world, is removed. But her first anxiety is to escape from Redcastle. The place has become hateful to her. She knows that the eyes of those who once flattered and courted her have been turned upon her in cold unpitying curiosity, that of all her summer friends not one has remained true to her in the hour of adversity, and she is eager to get beyond ken of those hard faces, beyond the sound of those false voices, which have spoken her fairly in the day of prosperity and kept silence when she had need of comfort. "I have no one but you, Alex," she says humbly, "no one but you and dear old Uncle Robert. I wonder that you are both so good to me." She goes straight from the court to Dr. Faunthorpe's house, and is curiously gentle and affectionate in her demeanour to her uncle and the two girls. Marion plunges into vehement hysterics at the sight of her elder sister, and on recovering from that attack embraces Sybil warmly, and is more demonstrative of sisterly affection than she has been for a long time. She is far more kindly disposed towards Sybil, penniless, and the mark of the world's scorn, than she ever felt towards the supposed heiress to Stephen Trenchard's wealth. As for Jenny, she goes fairly mad, hugs her sister to desperation, is very proud of her own performance in the witness box, and finally rushes out to the kitchen to ask Hester to make hot cakes for tea. No one who has not eaten Yorkshire cakes, and seen them made and baked in a Yorkshire kitchen by a brisk and energetic Yorkshire housewife, can have a just idea of the celerity with which this operation can be performed. But on this particular evening Sybil is far too languid to be tempted into injuring her digestion by the consumption of hot buttered cakes. She sits in a corner of the old parlour sofa, and takes her cup of tea in pensive silence, and the anxious little doctor sees that the events of the last few months have had a destroying influence upon his niece's health and beauty. He creeps close beside her, and feels her pulse. It is quick and irregular. "You want rest, my love," he says. "You must stay with us for a few weeks in your old room, and let me doctor you, and Hester nurse you, till you get strong again." "I like my old room, Uncle Robert, and I love to be with you, but I hate Redcastle. I should never get well here. Let me go with my husband to his new home, if he will have me." She looks pleadingly at Alexis, and sees that she has been forgiven. "My home is yours, Sybil, and I will take you there as soon as you are free to go. But I think you had better accept your uncle's hospitality for a little while, as your evidence will be required for Mr. Pilgrim's trial." "What?" asked Sybil. "Is it not all over?" "No, my love. The trial has to come yet, and the witnesses examined by the coroner and magistrate will have to repeat their evidence." "How dreadful!" sighs Sybil. "It is an ordeal to be gone through, my love, but when that is over we shall be free to go to Cheswold Grange, and all our troubles will be over, I hope, and before the summer is ended your uncle and your sisters must come and pay us a visit in Hampshire." "That will be delightful," cries Jenny rapturously. "Have you a nice garden?" "A glorious old garden, Jenny, with about a mile of wall fruit, such plums and peaches." "A nursery for English cholera," says the doctor. "And there's a pony, Jane. You'd like that, I think," observes Alexis. "Shouldn't I just? But before you come to Cheswold Grange I should like you to cure yourself of one bad habit, Jane. I won't mention it before company, but if you recall to mind a certain interview between a gentleman and a young lady, I dare say you will understand what I mean." Jenny blushes vehemently, remembering that little romance about Mrs. Yokohama Gray. So all is forgiveness and peace in the shabby old house at the end of the town, and Alexis, touched to the heart by his wife's contrition, and by those sad eyes of hers, which have a weary look that tells of suffering borne and hidden, feels that his old love for her is not quite dead, and that after all, faulty though she has been, she is the woman he would choose to sit by his fireside in the old house at Cheswold. Alexis returns to his hotel that evening, where there is much talk of Joel Pilgrim and his arrest. No one has any doubt of his guilt, and many go so far as to affirm that they have been convinced of it from the first, and have declared their convictions to their friends and acquaintance. These being called upon to bear witness to this fact, answer meanly that they don't exactly remember, that such opinions may have been expressed, but that they fail to recall them. In any case, Joel is prejudged in Redcastle, and there is a wonderful reaction about Sybil, who is exalted into a heroine and martyr, as if to have been wrongfully suspected was equivalent to having performed some great and noble action. Mrs. Stormont calls for the first time in her life at the shabby old house at the lower end of the town, and leaves quite a packet of cards for Dr. Faunthorpe and his nieces, and one of the Colonel's cards for the special benefit of Mr. Secretan. For it has become known to Redcastle that Alexis has a pretty little estate in Hampshire, and is by no means that fortuneless adventurer he was supposed to be on his first appearance upon the Redcastle stage. Everybody is eager for the trial, and there is a great deal of speculation as to the exact date at which it will come on, and who will be the Crown lawyer, and who will defend the accused. Before midnight there runs a rumour that Pilgrim has secured the famous Valentine for his defender, and there is an idea that he will get off. A clever counsel could shake the butler's evidence, make the jury disbelieve him altogether, and without his evidence how are they to bring the crime home to Pilgrim, ask the knowing ones. Before noon next day it is known that Joel Pilgrim has accepted his early defeat, and has gone forth to meet the fiat of a more terrible judge than that sage and learned lawyer who would have sat in judgment upon him at the forthcoming assizes. Early on the morning following his arrest he has found means to elude the vigilance of his warder, and has opened a vein with a small penknife, which he has contrived to keep hidden in the silken lining of his coat sleeve. Lying quietly on his prison bed, the warder slumbering on a pallet by his side, he has given himself his death wound, and let life ebb silently without a groan. He has occupied the earlier part of the night in writing, and this is the result, which is speedily devoured by the ravening maws of 1,000 different newspapers and given to the world. It figures on the hoardings before newsvendors' shops in fat black capitals. Startling revelation: the Redcastle murder. Dying confession of Joel Pilgrim. If it is any satisfaction to the world at large, which never gave me anything that I did not obtain by an appeal to its self-interest, to know the history of a man whose hours are now numbered, I give it in a few words. I am the son of Stephen Trenchard, the only offspring of his marriage with a Hindu dancing girl, and that marriage about as legal a union as a European of some social standing cares to contract with a low caste Indian. My mother had, I believe, little except her beauty to recommend her to an Englishman's notice, but she was inoffensive and she died young, two merits which secured her husband's respect. My father never acknowledged this marriage, or me as his son, but he took me into his office at an early age, and finding that I was tolerably shrewd and of his own way of thinking in commercial matters, had me well educated between the age of 18 and 24, and at 25 took me for his partner. The fortunes of our house varied as years went on. We made money very fast, but we had the misfortune sometimes to lose it even faster. Our gains generally tempted us to make losses, and each successful transaction brought an unlucky follower at its heels. Thus, if we made 100% by indigo one year, we perhaps lost 150% by indigo the next, being lured into some reckless speculation, time bargains, and the rest of it. Our opium trade brought us most money, and we trafficked in other goods, which proved profitable merchandise, but somewhat damaged the character of our house. In other words, rather than let our vessels ground upon their beef bones for want of a remunerative cargo, we occasionally went in quietly for the slave trade, supplied our Demerara friends with coolies, and shipped a good deal of livestock of this kind at different ports. To put it briefly, we were general dealers on a large scale. The business had never been weaker than in that year when my father suddenly took it into his head that it was time for him to retire, and drew £10,000 out of the house, some thousands beyond our real capital. It left me with a crippled business, and I felt that my father had done me a great wrong by this selfish retirement. For the first year after his return to England fortune favoured me, and the prospects of the house brightened. I made one or two lucky hits, and began to pluck up spirit. But this state of things did not last long. I lost a shipload of coolies under somewhat painful circumstances. The ship and supposed cargo, not the coolies, were heavily insured. The underwriters refused to pay, and there was some talk of scuttling. This scandal, although strangled in the birth, did me harm. A commercial man's reputation is as delicate a blossom as a hothouse flower. Any chill wind nips it. When I found things going to the bad in Calcutta, I came home, thinking that my father might help me out of my difficulties, or at least enable me to float my unwieldy ship a little while longer by the use of a few of those thousands he had squeezed out of the business. This he peremptorily refused, and had the injustice to accuse me of bad trading. We had bitter words on the subject on many occasions, and not content with refusing to help me, he urged me to raise money to pay off the remaining £10,000 due to him by a deed of dissolution, which he had made me sign before he left Calcutta. He resigning his share of the business in consideration of receiving £20,000, 10,000 at the time of execution of the deed, 10,000 within 3 years from that date. The time had expired, and he urged me repeatedly to raise the money. When he found that I had set my heart upon marrying his niece, whom I naturally supposed to be a single woman, he made my payment of this £10,000 a condition of my marriage. No money, no wife, he said, thus using my tenderest feelings as a lever to wrench money out of me. I think this plan of proceeding hardly comes under the head of fatherly affection. Of the tragedy which terminated the story of my father's existence I have nothing to say. Time may perhaps make that mystery clear. I shall not gratify idle curiosity by any revelation, supposing it to be in my power to reveal anything touching this question, which I leave as a subject for speculation to that new school which devotes its labours to the studies of psychological mysteries. This is all, disappointing perhaps to the world in general, but giving Redcastle a new subject for conversation. Imagine that horrid Indian being Mr. Trenchard's son after all, exclaims Mrs. Stormont, when she and her dear Mrs. Groshen meet to discuss the latest scandal over their harlequin teacups. I always thought there was a likeness. I can't say that I saw any resemblance. Such a difference in complexion, you know. But what a horribly disreputable set these Trenchards seem to have been, says Mrs. Groshen, in a wholesale way, as if there had been a regiment of them. Yes, selling slaves and opium and scuttling ships and doing everything horrid. And to think that we would have asked him to dinner, cries the banker's wife, remembering how often she has squandered her housekeeping money upon hothouse fruit and flowers to decorate the board at which Stephen Trenchard was to be the chief guest. How lucky that dreadful pilgrim never accepted our invitations, exclaims Mrs. Stormont. I have no doubt he was afraid to show himself in society. He eats with chopsticks, I dare say. I rather think that chopsticks are Chinese, my dear, replies Mrs. Groshen, whose remembrance of the Child's Guide to Useful Knowledge has not been weakened by the lapse of so many years as have gone by since her elder friend left a fashionable boarding school, carefully finished in all those elegant accomplishments which take 6 years to learn and can be comfortably forgotten in 3. Thus runs town talk in quiet Redcastle. There will be no trial, and among the general public interest in Stephen Trenchard's murder languishes, and soon dies for want of nutriment. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Eaton. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 55. Epilogue. All through the rest of the summer weather, till the leaves change from green to red and yellow, and the sturdy oaks, slow to bud and last to succumb to time the destroyer, have put on their russet livery, Sybil lies in the chief bedchamber at Cheswold Grange, sick nigh unto death. She has broken down utterly now that the struggle is over, now that all the storms are ended, and her frail bark safe in harbour. There is no violent illness, no raging fever of brain or body, only an extreme prostration, which for a long time baffles the skill of an intelligent physician and a careful family doctor. She lies in the bright, pretty bedroom, with its old panelled walls painted pale pink and cream colour, its needlework pictures, its quaint furniture, and many relics of a departed generation. There is a wide window opposite her bed that extends from ceiling to floor, and through this she listlessly contemplates the fair landscape, the smiling garden, the autumnal glory of the park. She suffers little pain, except such weariness as attends extreme prostration. She is at peace, and even declares herself happy. "I have lived long enough, Alex," she says one day, when her strength has ebbed to the lowest point compatible with life, and the doctors have begun to despair of the efficiency of the pharmacopoeia in this particular case. Alexis, deeply moved, sits by her bed and holds her feeble hand in the dim autumn twilight. "I am content for my earthly race to finish here. You have forgiven me. That is enough." "But have you no thought of me, Sybil? Is it kind to talk like that?" "Dear Alex, you have been more than good to me, but I have not forgotten what you said that evening of our meeting in the old room at Mrs. Bonny's. Love is dead, you told me." "That was said under the influence of anger, Sybil. I thought it was true, but sorrow soon fastened the old knot again. Sorrow and peril reunited us, Sybil." "And do you really love me? I know that you have forgiven me, but are you sure you love me still?" "Very sure, as much and as truly as I ever loved you in old Kensington Gardens, under the elms, when I told the Hazleton children fairy tales, and my life and yours seemed as sweet a fairy tale as any of those old nursery stories, and as sure of a blissful ending." "Oh, Alex, is that the truth?" "As I live, darling." "Then I think I shall make an effort and get well," replies Sybil, with a sigh of utter contentment. "I have been willing to glide gently out of life, believing that however good you were to me, I could never hope to win more than your forgiveness. But now I shall try very hard to get well." She keeps her word. Whether her illness has reached its natural turning point, the tide of life flowing back to its source, or whether the ardent desire of the patient to live helps the work of recovery, the medical man cannot say. But from this time there is a change. Slowly but surely health and youth come back to the pale wan face. The lovely eyes lose their glassy lustre, and grow bright with happy thoughts. Faint gleams of carnation flit like the shadow of a sunset cloud over the marble pallor, then linger, and warm the pallid cheek into life and beauty. "Your love has won me back from the grave, Alex," whispers Sybil, 4 or 5 weeks after that talk in the twilight, when the family doctor, that very Mr. Scalpel, who attended Alexis after his accident, has declared that Mrs. Secretan's recovery is absolutely marvellous. When Sybil is out of danger, Richard Plowden, who has been a faithful friend and comforter throughout this time of trouble, and has acted as Trot's chief nurse and playmate into the bargain, departs somewhat abruptly upon a journey, the business and destination whereof he does not reveal to his dear friend Alexis. "It's a little bit of a trip I've been meditating for a longish time," he says. "I'll tell you all about it when I come back. I think I shall start to-morrow." "You'll write to us while you're away, of course, Dick?" "Well, yes, if I can manage it," replies Mr. Plowden, with rather a sheepish air. "But you mustn't be alarmed if you don't hear from me. I shall be moving about from place to place, you see, and I may be out of the way of post offices, off the beaten track, you know." "Good gracious!" exclaims Alexis. "Are you going to the centre of Africa? Is my modest geographer coming out as a second Sir Samuel Baker?" Alexis is too much occupied with his wife's recovery just now to be very curious about his friend. He thinks Dick's movements are somewhat eccentric, and that is all. "Perhaps he objects to my being here," says Sybil, who has learned to think very humbly of herself of late. "Object to you, Sybil? Why, you must know that he is absolutely devoted to you, and has been almost as anxious as I was during your illness. He was prejudiced against you before he saw you, out of affection for me, poor fellow, thinking that I had been hardly used. But when once you came back to love and duty, he was your slave. For about a month nothing is heard of Richard Plowden, and Alexis is beginning to feel somewhat uneasy about his friend's fate, when he receives a letter in Dick's neat hand, posted at Cannes. "My dear friend," writes Richard, "when I left you and Mrs. Secretan so abruptly, I was departing upon so daring and wild an expedition that I felt too much ashamed of my own audacity to tell you my errand. I came to the south of France to discover whether there was any hope of my ever winning, by long years of patient devotion, the dearest and best, purest and most unselfish of women. You had told me to hope in the day of my despondency, and I had hoped, although I scorned myself for my foolishness in hoping. At last, I told myself that it was worse than foolish to go on hoping and dreaming. I must put it to the touch, and win or lose it all, as Montrose says. So I came here, found my sweetest Linda working industriously at her art, pensive, but not altogether unhappy. She was delighted to see me, not for my own sake, you may be sure, but because I could tell her all about Trot. How I have blessed that dear child! She was never tired of hearing me talk of him. I spent all my evenings at her aunt's house, such a dear old lady, the aunt, talking about Trot, and a little about art and science and literature, and my own small views and ambitions. What happy evenings they were! Well, Alex, I am too proud of her, too ashamed of my own unworthiness, to tell you much more. I can only say that God has been very good to me, that I am more blessed than ever I hoped to be, that if I had been born in the dear old fairy times which I have told Trot so much about, that I have grown almost to believe in them myself. If I had been the special favourite of some omnipotent good fairy, and had had a talking bird, and Fortunatus's purse, and an invisible cap, and a flying carpet, and the princess with the golden locks for my bride, I could not have been one whit happier than I am, or more astonished at my own happiness. I am in such a state of surprise that I am doubtful of my own identity, and hardly feel sure that I have any right to sign myself your faithful friend, Dick Plowden. Very happy are Alexis and his wife one sunny morning early in December, when Sybil, leaning on her husband's arm, and with Trot at her side, makes her first round of the Cheswold domain. The hoar-frost whitens the lawn and meadows, yet there are late roses still blooming on the wall. Alexis insists upon his wife seeing everything, hothouses, stables, piggeries even, and Sybil inspects and admires rapturously enough to content an exacting lord of the manor. "It is all lovely," she exclaims, "and what is best of all, the place suits you, Alex, and you suit the place to perfection. You seem to have been made for a country squire. How strange it is to know that Providence held this in store for you in that bitter time at Mrs. Bonny's, while I was waiting for a dead man's shoes. You, who never cringed to any man, or courted any inheritance, have been blessed by fortune." The end. End of chapter 55. End of Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon.